It is now my pleasure to introduce you all to the next panel. So take a deep breath, and we're going to move on to the data panel. You've heard a number of people talk about data, the importance of data, the sensitivity of data. And so we have a wonderful panel to talk about that. It's my job and privilege here to introduce you to my law partner, Nicole Perry. You heard Kurt Kirchner talk about a convening that we did in Houston a couple of years ago, which is really what got our firm really immersed in this space. Nicole was the local host of that. She's based in Houston and has done, coming out of that conference, some really exceptional work on the public education sector, and has worked with a number of people in the mayor of Houston's office, Minal Davis, and others to do public awareness campaigns, which then evolved into similar presentations and sharing of what Houston did with cities across the US and then across the world. So one thing we won't have time to talk about today is how your city and how your local municipal governments might get involved in doing public relations campaigns in your local community. If you have an interest in that, give Nicole a call after this. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Nicole to introduce her panel and to talk to you about the important role that data does and can play in the fight against human trafficking. Nicole?
Thank you, Laura, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to briefly introduce my fellow panelists. Becky Austen is the Lighthouse Director for Texas-based anti-trafficking nonprofit organization Allies Against Slavery. We also have Jennifer Everett, a cybersecurity, privacy, and data protection partner in Jones Day's Washington, D.C. office. And last but not least is Mary Alexander Myers, who's also in Jones Day's cybersecurity practice and resident in Atlanta, Georgia. Each of my fellow panelists come to you with an extensive background on data issues in the fight against human trafficking. And each of us has evaluated data use cases and implemented the appropriate legal protective measures out of respect for the data subject, which is usually the victim or survivor of human trafficking, as well as to comply with applicable laws. So the purpose of our presentation today is to identify the types of data that are available to combat trafficking and provide an overview of the key legal issues you may encounter in collecting, using, and disclosing that data. So we're going to drill down a bit more into that. First, Becky's going to walk us through the importance of data in combating human trafficking. Mary Alexander is going to provide a framework for the collection, use, and disclosure of data. We'll then all describe some of the tools that can be utilized to reduce overall risk with data usage in this context. Jennifer is going to describe how HIPAA and other comparable state laws may be implicated by data usage. I know you've heard a little bit about that today from the healthcare panel. And then Becky will provide some valuable insight on Allies Against Slavery's own data work and leave us with several key takeaways. Now, there will be an opportunity for the panel to address questions at the end, so please feel free to use the Q&A feature to raise any questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Becky to give us an overview of data that we're going to be talking about today.
All right, thank you so much, Nicole, and really appreciate being here on the panel with all of you today. I'm the Lighthouse Director with Allies Against Slavery. We're a nonprofit organization based in Austin, Texas, and our mission is to harness the power of technology, data, and partnerships to combat human trafficking and protect the freedom and dignity of its victims and survivors. We've developed a platform called Lighthouse. It's a software platform that we use to help identify victims of trafficking, coordinate their care, and gain insight from the data that we collect. We have a partnership in place with the Office of the Texas Governor Child Sex Trafficking Team here in the state to deliver a statewide platform for human trafficking. And by aggregating this data, we're gaining new insights into the prevalence and the demographics of trafficking in the state of Texas, and also how we invest and address our remedies to combat it. I first want to say how grateful we are to Jones Day. We're a very small nonprofit. We have no attorneys on our staff. They helped us last year to upgrade our legal agreements and our processes. I learned a ton over a few months about all of the federal and state regulations that we would have to address as a part of our work, and just want to express our gratitude for being able to work with that team and have them share their expertise. My background is actually in the private sector in technology. I spent most of my adult life at IBM. So we dealt with data and technology every day and solving business and scientific types of problems. But when you're dealing with data in this kind of work, it's a lot different. You know, in the tech world, data is in the abstract, it's zeros and ones. In this work, every data element relates back to a human being. It's a victim, a survivor, a vulnerable youth who's at risk for exploitation, a trafficker, a buyer, a law enforcement professional, a service professional. So when you're thinking about that human aspect of the data, you consider it's a very powerful tool in the work that we do, but we have to be very mindful of how it's used. And so we actually spent a lot of time having conversations around data ethics and governance, not just what the data could do or what insight we might get or how it could be used or visualized, but how do we protect the data? How do we ensure that privacy and security is maintained? And also, how do we ensure that the data is helping people, that it's not being used to harm or re-traumatize individuals or reinforce aspects of systemic injustice? All data tells a story, and there's a lot of nuance in storytelling. So you think about any of the data, you know, that you receive in the news or through friends and colleagues, it is helpful when it informs you, when it motivates you, when it engages you to act. It can be harmful if it misinforms you, if it causes you to have judgment or frightens or angers you. So you know, we really have to consider how the data is being analyzed and protected and visualized. An example of this is that we have the opportunity to collect gender and sexual orientation information in our platform for individuals as they're screened. And so you would say, okay, that data is going to tell a great story because it helps us to understand specific issues or vulnerabilities associated with individuals who are LGBTQI. The downside of the data is that it's not widely reported. So, you know, many institutions chose not to include that when they did screenings, or it's just sparse and underreported. And so the harm is that it may minimize the impact or the scope of the issue, and folks would set it aside, saying, well, that's a very small percentage of individuals being trafficked, as opposed to using that data for good. So when you think about, you know, the who, what, why, where, when, how of data use, it's important to just consider, you know, first of all, who is using the data. And in our work, it's service providers, it's law enforcement, and individuals who are making policy or advising those. So the Texas Governor's Office Child Sex Trafficking Team is a good example there of a key stakeholder that works with legislators across the state to help provide, you know, policy and budget to combat trafficking. In terms of the data that's available, we get data from a lot of different sources. A lot of what we collect is victim or survivor centered and comes from service providers, but we're also collecting data from law enforcement professionals, from organizations that are gathering data about buyers, about traffickers. We're looking at cases and prosecutions. We oftentimes will collect data that may have identifiable information in it and be disaggregated, but when we visualize it for the purpose of gaining insight, we de-identify that data and aggregate it so that you can't trace that data back to an individual to make them more vulnerable, but you can get very powerful insight from the data in its aggregate form. In terms of data use, some of you might say, well, we've been collecting data around trafficking for, you know, forever. I've got a stack of reports on my desk a mile high that, you know, that tells us all about what's happening. But typically that data has been siloed. It's point in time data. It may be, you know, a research study or something you get statically once a quarter. And each one is distinct. So there's no way to really see, you know, how is that data informing you when it comes together. So using technology and artificial intelligence and other techniques, we have the ability to visualize that data in real time and suddenly start to gain, you know, those aha moments, those new stories that the data wasn't telling us in its previous forms. The relevance can be, you know, global to local. In the keynote at the start of the session this morning, you know, there was talk of making sure that our solutions and our work is customized and personalized to the situation. So a data story at a global level or even at the state of Texas level might not be the same as a data story or analysis that takes place, you know, here in Travis County, Texas, because the, you know, the nuances of the data are significant as you scale in or out. So just, you know, consider the relevance of the data and the specific aspects of the data that you're collecting depending on that use and its scope. In terms of where it can be helpful, our focus again is around victims and survivors first. We're centered in that work. So it's really powerful in our aid to those, but it's also used by law enforcement to help understand where the trafficking is occurring and how to pinpoint their efforts and apply the right kind of expertise and resources to that. It can be used to understand how folks are recruited, how they're buying sex, where they're going, allocate the right kind of resources to remedy the issues. So, all of these considerations come into the data work. It's not just about collecting it and creating, interesting maps or visualizations for the screen. With that context, I'd like to pass it on to Mary Alexander to talk more about the legal work that we embarked on in this project and in general, how you might apply those principles to your work.
Sure. Thanks, Becky. Once you, I think, have your sort of mission or purpose for combating human trafficking from the data perspective, we're going to look at a couple of things as you start to think about the legal basics of structuring legal compliance of any sort of project or initiative like this. I think first, identifying the data sources. As Becky said, this can include government entities, law enforcement, even different service providers, nonprofit organizations, and of course, survivors themselves. There's always great evolving and sort of creative work in this area. So there's always new sort of challenges and, interesting issues that come up around data sources. So I think for that reason, it's incredibly important to identify from the start, where data sources are and how those could change in the near term of any project. From that, thinking about the use cases, what we found is really, when you drill down on certain use cases of data, it illuminates parts of projects that weren't initially obvious. So for example, are there issues around minors or healthcare providers and data that maybe initially just identifying data sources and various uses didn't flesh out, but certain unique use cases might draw, bring to the surface, I guess, various sensitivities that from a legal perspective, we particularly want to focus on and make sure are addressed from a compliance perspective. And then of course, all this flows into from the legal perspective, how can we focus on the legal basis for not only collecting the information from data sources, but also how it's used? Is it aggregated? Is it identifiable to a person? And there may be even various ownership rights in the data if it's coming from a government entity. And then thinking about the basis for how you're going to disclose it. Are you maybe collecting it in an identifiable way, but disclosing it in only an aggregated and de-identified way? All of those things are incredibly relevant from the legal perspective when considering how to make a project like this compliant with various laws that may apply. So with that, we'll go to the next slide and talk about some other considerations.
Thanks, Mary Alexander. And so now we want to talk a little bit about how risk can be mitigated or transferred through the data assessment process that Mary Alexander just described. The first stage of any data assessment is to identify your use cases so that you can categorize the data and track your data flows. I would suggest that this is a three-step process. The first step is to put your data into buckets. So as Becky said, you may have identifiable data on human trafficking victims in your database. And as Mary Alexander referenced, identifiable data means that it can be tied back to a particular person. So that's a bucket of data that you have access to. The second step would be to map out how that data is used. So it may be used in aggregated form to help identify survivors and coordinate survivor care, as is the case with Allies Against Slavery. So once you've identified the buckets of data that you have and you've assessed how they're being used, the third step is to determine to whom they will be disclosed. And continuing with our hypothetical, it might be disclosed to government entities and service providers. The data flow process that I've just described is best depicted visually for each data category. So you might use a Visio chart or a flowchart tool to show how that flow or transfer of data is made within your organization. Once you have the data flows mapped out, you can then assess what legal protections are needed to allow for each use case. And that's where you get into the second box that you see on the slide, which is to identify the types of protections that are needed. You have to, of course, determine what applicable laws may be at issue. There may be federal, state, local, or even international laws that apply to the use of your particular data that's collected. So just to give a couple of very brief examples, personally identifiable data may be at issue and is subject to various state laws. Data for victims of sexual assault, something we'll talk about briefly again in a moment. Mentioned earlier in today's presentations were child abuse reporting obligations, which may be triggered from some of the information that you have access to. Confidentiality of communicable disease information. So if you come into contact with information about a victim's HIV status, for example, there are particular rules that govern that use of data. Parental consent requirements if you're talking about data for minors. And then of course, HIPAA and other similar state laws, which Jennifer is going to be covering in more detail in a moment. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, frankly. Some states, for example, do provide special protections for victims of sexual assault and provide limitations for who can receive the identity information, the personal history information, or the background information for that victim or survivor. I practice in Texas, and Texas happens to be one of those states. This Texas statute does, however, allow for disclosure of information if sufficient consent is obtained. And so that's a really nice segue into our next box, which is consents and authorizations. And Mary Alexander is just going to walk us through that very briefly.
That's right. And sort of as Nicole referenced, there are laws that, depending on the legal basis for collecting, using, and disclosing the data, you may want to obtain a consent, for example, under the GDPR, depending on the legal basis, or an authorization, which is more usually more targeted towards healthcare data and HIPAA. There's also, in our experience, there's been reasons that while a consent or authorization may not be legally required in every instance, when you're talking about survivor data that's quite sensitive, there may be times that you want to use a consent or authorization to also be very transparent about the ways that the data is being used. This really dovetails also with sort of how a project or initiative might be evolving. We always consider what's the scope of the consent for the use of the data. If you're only obtaining authorization or consent for one use, that does restrict the way that you can use it throughout a project or initiative. So any consent or authorization should contemplate the full use of the data and the sort of full runway of any project or initiative. Likewise, I think privacy policies and other sort of website agreements, or people think of them as like click-through agreements, are particularly relevant here for many survivors or people we would call data subjects. So when the data is identifiable, it's them, it's that person. That's going to be most feasibly the way that they will find out how their data is being used. And so these are also many of these laws that can apply. They don't exclude nonprofit organizations. That's sometimes a case-by-case analysis, but it's not something that just because an organization is nonprofit that they don't have to comply with all of these laws. So for that reason, privacy policies and other website agreements can be really good to not only comply with applicable law, but also to be very transparent about an organization's mission and their purpose in collecting and using data. Jennifer, do you want to talk about data sharing agreements?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary Alexander and Nicole. The last component here is thinking about sort of the contractual components to, with whom, the parties for whom you are sharing data. If you're an organization with the OST that Becky is speaking about, particularly with Lighthouse, As Becky mentioned earlier, there are a number of parties with whom you may be sharing data. As such, it's important that, while the data sharing agreements will allow you to do sort of, really meet objectives in terms of identifying potential, victims of crimes or identifying, bad actors or criminals who are involved in modern slavery or human trafficking. At the same time, the legal obligations have to be carefully thought of. There may be, for example, decisions with respect to, can I disclose the data at all? What privacy laws are going to apply? Is the data that's going to be aggregated in what instance? How long do we have to keep the data? Are there going to be parameters around data retention and storage? Where will the data actually be stored and processed, as that will trigger other privacy laws as well? So there needs to be sort of a careful consideration in determining who are the parties that are going to be a part of the data sharing agreement, and then likewise from there, carefully assessing ownership rights, liability rights, and with really providing parameters around the data disclosure and use cases. I think this takes us nicely, Mayor Alexander, to talking about HIPAA at a high level, and I welcome you to join in as well here, particularly given your experience. But HIPAA is just one healthcare law here in the United States that may govern a data sharing agreement, or if you're sharing with different partners, depending on the data that is being processed. Now, the US, unlike Europe and other jurisdictions, does not have an omnibus privacy law like the GDPR, many of you may be familiar with, but rather our privacy laws are governed at the state level or at the federal level at industry specific. That includes with HIPAA. Now, HIPAA covers covered entities and business associates. Covered entities are what we think of in sort of three buckets. We have healthcare providers. Examples may be clinics, dentists, or pharmacies. Most healthcare providers, assuming that they are involved in certain transactions that have been approved by HHS. Another bucket of covered entities includes healthcare plans, as well as clearinghouses. And if you are not a covered entity, you may be a business associate, I think loosely defined as maybe your service provider that's providing services to the covered entities with respect to the PHI that you may be processing or using. Now, PHI is just the short term for protected health information. And certainly in the context of mitigating risk of human trafficking or assisting victims of human trafficking, you may have, like Becky mentioned, access to healthcare information. Medical records of an individual, for example, when you're dealing with healthcare providers or others. And so HIPAA is designed to, when you are, for example, in Becky's circumstances, you may have to determine whether or not you're a business associate to a particular covered entity. And in those instances, there are privacy and security rules that will apply. And in particular, you may have to engage in written contracts that will limit the use of data, the disclosure of the information, what information has to be disclosed to the individual patient with respect to the use of their data. And likewise, thinking carefully about when data can be disclosed. As Mayor Alexander mentioned, that may be under the auspices of authorization of the individual, but we may have to carefully think about other circumstances where authorization is not either available or may be difficult to obtain. State law may may allow for disclosure of health information in certain circumstances. I would note now that HIPAA, there has been proposed modifications to the privacy rule that are currently under public comment. But the HIPAA privacy rule also contemplates that covered entities may be able to disclose data in the event of a threat or security measure as well, a threat of the particular patient. So we'll need to carefully look at the privacy rule and those modifications, as they may have some impact, for example, on when instances in which you can share data. I'd like to just note that at the end here, in addition to disclosures of information, carefully thinking about use, there's no more important time, whether we're talking about in the HIPAA context or outside of HIPAA for state laws or international laws, to think about the security and safeguards associated with healthcare data. We are living in a land of sort of a post-pandemic environment. Ransomware attacks, data security breaches, bad guys all around are looking for opportunities to get access to data. And the healthcare sector in particular has become a particular victim to a number of data breaches, ransomware attacks that may disclose to patient data that may be stored on databases. And so thinking carefully about the security measures that you may have in place from a technical, organizational, physical measure as well. Because indeed, outside of HIPAA, there are state data breach notification laws that apply. There are state disclosure laws that apply in terms of how data is securely stored and disclosed. And as well as there are state-based laws that are like HIPAA that may expand the obligations under HIPAA as well. And for those of you who are joining us from outside of Europe, outside of the United States, there may be international laws that apply as well, for example, the GDPR. So all of this to say is that data sharing agreements are beneficial, and we regularly advise clients in terms of putting one together that will allow for us to meet the objectives, but doing so in a way that carefully contemplates all the laws that we've addressed today. With that, I'll turn it over back to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I know, not surprisingly, Jennifer's in high demand, so she has to jump to another presentation right now. But later in our slides, there will be contact information for each of us. So please don't hesitate to reach out to her if you have any questions. And thank you, Jennifer. And Becky, I'll turn it over to you to take us home.
All right, thank you so much. So if we think of, back again to what I said about data being a powerful tool for telling stories, there are certain things that we've got to bear in mind as, as we acquire that data, as we obtain consent for that data, and as we use that data. Around the first point here on the slide, it's important to really trace the data from its origin to its use. And we actually went through that exercise with our colleagues here at Jones Day, where they would ask us, what happens when a youth comes into a shelter and, there's an intake, and what's the interaction there, and what consent is obtained. And then when they're screened as a possible trafficking victim, what does that look like? And, so literally stepping through every step in the process and determining at each point along the way when consent is obtained, when the data is obtained, when the data is entered into Lighthouse, when the data is, aggregated in a dashboard, what does that sort of chain of data use look like? And then, how do we make sure that we understand that and have the right protections in place at every step along the way? To the second point, it's very important to make sure that we're considering all of the kind of corner conditions, mitigating the risks, having the right agreements and forms. I can't tell you how many times, on our calls with Mary Alexander and Nicole, we would say, well, that's never going to happen. Does that really matter? That, that's so unlikely. And they would say, well, you always need to consider what happens if it does. If that weird use case scenario pops up, are you prepared for that? So we also had to consider the sort of the terms and the protections for Allies as a company, as a nonprofit, for Lighthouse as a product, a software platform, for our partners, the service providers who use Lighthouse, for their clients who are the vulnerable youth who come through their doors, or adults, who may be exploited, for the general public who visits our website and obtains information about trafficking. So again, we had to kind of break down every different, audience and understand for each, where are the risks and what protections do we need in place. This last point around shortcuts, again, is really important. In our world, the service providers, they've got already a stack of consent forms and processes and things that they've got to follow as a child advocacy agency or law enforcement or what have you. They don't want one more system and one more process. So again, we sort of pushed back on consent and said, surely we don't need that, do we? Can we just put a statement in an existing consent form that says your data is in Lighthouse? And really got, well educated about the implications of doing that versus having the right kind of consent in place, and the importance of doing that really to, again, protect the individual, protect, the service providers, and protect allies. So I will say that even if you're tempted to take the shortcuts and you're going to want to do that, listen to your expert attorneys and advisors and really follow their guidance here on, ensuring that all of those protections are in place. With that, Nicole, I'll turn it back to you for Q&A.
Thank you so much to Becky and Mary Alexander for joining us today. And we do have just a few minutes for questions. And so I've been monitoring the Q&A panel, which please do feel free to use and if you have additional questions. I have a good one here, I think, for Becky. You referenced your relationship with the state government here in Texas. Do you have advice on contracting with government agencies to accept or provide data?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say it can be a very, powerful and influential kind of a partnership. Having the Office of the Texas Governor Child Sex Trafficking Team, hand in hand with us doing our work. It opens doors. It provides access to agencies that might not otherwise take a call from us. They have access to data that that they've been able to make freely available to us through the grant that we have with them. So there are so many upsides to having that partnership between a nonprofit organization and a government organization. That said, government organizations are oftentimes very reluctant to share data. So as much as we have the warmth of the governor's office sharing their data with us, as soon as we go to adjacent agencies and in public safety or child welfare or law enforcement or what have you, everyone's kind of holding their data really close. And so it's important to, again, just kind of peel back the layers of how is that data being used. And yes, it has identifiable information, but we're going to de-identify that on its way out. Or we need it in disaggregate form to gain insight from it, but we'll re-aggregate it as it gets presented in the dashboard. So really peeling back the layers, having a lot of patience, and having, again, kind of a support team of attorneys or advisors or other government professionals who can kind of stand with you and say, well, we've already crossed that bridge. This is how we did it. These are the protections we put in place, and it's okay. But I think this is also cultural. This has been said in a couple of the, the other sessions, that the instant reaction is, I won't share my data because that way I can keep it safe. And I think culturally what we need to do is change the mindset to, I want to share my data because that will help victims and survivors. It will help combat this issue and eradicate trafficking. How do I do that safely? So I think if we can just sort of make that mindset shift, it changes the conversation. And I think it's going to open up a lot more organizations to be willing to share data and to do it in the right way that protects all of us.
Thank you, Becky. That was a terrific response. I see that we are at the end of our time now. If you do have any questions, you see our contact information on the slide in front of you, and I do believe there'll be an ability to get access to all of the slides after today's presentation. Don't hesitate to reach out to any of us if you have questions through this process. We want to thank you for your attention and your time today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Dave to introduce the next moderator.
Well, thanks. Great panel. And I'm just so inspired by this entire day. It's been incredible. And what's great is it's really a holistic approach. I think sometimes with Rotary, we have educators, we have law enforcement, we have business leaders, we have financial people in our clubs, and sometimes they don't realize that they can actually do something and do something well in their sphere of influence. And so we've kind of proven that today. It's just incredible and inspiring. And thank you so much for your panel and all the other panels that have come before you. It's been an amazing day.